Okay, good afternoon. Welcome to the IUFRO Task Force on post-conflict forest restoration, landscape forest restoration. Today we have first, I'm Sergei Ziptsev, I'm moderator of this event. I'm working for National University of Life and Environmental Science of Ukraine. And today we have a webinar number 1 from series of webinars toward exploring challenges and pathway of forest restoration. And today we will talk about Eastern Ukraine because for the moment it's the largest minefield and largest destroyed environment maybe in the world. So our today's speaker is Brian Milakovsky, senior forester from New England Forestry Foundation, Maine, United States. Brian has extensive experience in forest conservation and management across New England, Ukraine, northern Sweden, and the Russian Far East. His work focuses on biodiversity conservation and managing forests. And first of all, I would like to present you IUFRO, who is organizing this webinar. This is a global network of forest science collaboration. And IUFRO is a non-profit, non-governmental international network of forest scientists with headquarters in Vienna, Austria. And it's open for all individuals and organizations dedicated to forest and forest product research and education. IUFRO advances research excellence and knowledge sharing and fostering development of science-based solution, provides a diverse thematic structure on forest-related research, and address research, like in our case, in our task force, that priority for different regions of the world. This is a management of IUFRO. You see president, vice president, and CEO of this organization. IUFRO is International Union of Forest Research Organization. It's structured from 9 divisions devoted to different part of forestry, and then research groups and 13 task force. Among them, one of the task force we are now inside of this webinar, and 4 special programs and the projects. And now we are talking more about interdisciplinary forest science, like in the case of Eastern Ukraine, where not only forest, but forest environment, biodiversity, productivity, climate change, and other topics are relevant. And task force coordinates non-voting members of IUFRO board and invited to attend any board meetings. Our task force called Post-Conflict Forest Landscape Restoration. Now you see the sad pictures actually from Eastern Ukraine. That's what we are talking about. And of course, war is going on. It's paradox. War is going on. The fight is not stopped. But we are thinking about rehabilitation, and we should think it now. And this is the aim of this seminar. Then I invite you to join as a member IUFRO and get these benefits. And please use your phone to scan this QR code, and then we will see the country you represent. Returning to Brian, I can say that Brian actually since 2016 spent time until 2022 in Eastern Ukraine. He used to work for USAID, helping local population, foresters, environmental organization to deal with this situation post-war and during war rehabilitation. Okay, now with this, I would like to invite Brian to start his presentation, and then we will have Q&A session.
Thank you, Sergey. Let me share. So thank you so much to UFRO for the opportunity to present on this work. Let's hope it goes to slideshow in a moment here, uh, which I was able to publish on last year in Forest Ecology and Management with Dr. Ziptsev, Victor Miranyuk, who's on this call with us today, and I believe 4 or 5 other Ukrainian. And I'll be speaking today about uh, forest steppe recovery after landscape fires in eastern Ukraine. And I say forest steppe here because I think it's important for us to really think about this as a crisis for that kind of ecosystem in the East. It's not exclusively a forest crisis, and I'll get a lot into that. And I'll be looking at, how we got to the stage where war could lead to such incredible destruction, which has a lot to do with how this landscape was formed by land use history, climate change, changes in institutional capacity to deal with fires, and then only then by the war over the last several hundred years. So again, for decades before war began in eastern Ukraine, which began in 2014, it's important to say, there was the smaller, more localized war in the Donetsk and Luhansk regions of eastern Ukraine beginning in 2014, burning very hot until the summer of 2015, then being at a very low ebb until the massive full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022. Um, Before that, for decades, the forest landscape of eastern Ukraine was already undergoing transformation under the pressure of climate change and the intensifying forest fires it was causing, and change in the capacity of the Ukrainian state to deal with them. Um, War accelerated that fragmentation and the formation of a new vegetative mosaic. But it isn't as if we had a great situation, war dropped in, wrecked everything, and we'd like to maybe get back to that great situation we were in before. It was a complex of issues already before war became the major destruction factor. And so landscape restoration now, after these wars, and once state control is returned over all of eastern Ukraine, it's over, part of it has already been returned, Ukrainian state control. After that, we really will need to think about landscape restoration that embraces a more diverse vegetative mosaic than the one that we saw in 2014 or 2022. That includes grasslands, wetlands, and really we need to move away from a forest management regime that's strictly dependent on artificial regeneration. So where are we talking about? In green here, you see outlined the terraces and floodplain of the Siversky Donets River, largest river in Ukraine east of the Dnipro, which is that very large water body you see west of our study area. The largest tributary of the Don River. And as you can see, an extraordinary forest oasis in a very dry agricultural landscape, in which forest cover historically was low and is even lower now. And also, as you can see, the headwaters of the Siversky Donets are in Russia, in the Belgorod region, and the mouth of it is in Russia, in the Rostov region, but almost the entirety of the actual watershed is within the eastern provinces of Ukraine. A little historical background. There's very good records of what this landscape looked like, what its vegetation, its vegetative mosaic looked like, because before permanent settlement by Europeans, because this region, like many areas of for instance, North America, really didn't have permanent settlement until the 1700s. It had millennia of nomadic settlement, Turkic peoples, Persian peoples, Slavs coming in, clashing, not a situation where there was any kind of stable settlement for many centuries. Finally, the Russian Empire and the Ottoman Empire have it out. The Russian Empire wins and begins settling mostly Ukrainians, also Russians, also Germans and Greeks and all kinds of other peoples in this part of the world, only in the middle of the 18th century. And so you have a bunch of Tsarist era academics coming and describing the landscape, or surveyors, that is, people with sort of a semi-scientific outlook, coming and writing very good descriptions and drawing maps. So we have some idea of what was here. And it was a mosaic of closed canopy pine forests dominated by Scots pine, um, savannas of Scots pine and what we English oak, right? Quercus robur, um, sandy steppe grasslands that are embedded with small ponds and patches of hardwood of deciduous cover, and then a floodplain and a lower terrace of very high productivity oak, ash, uh, poplar, deciduous forests. It was a mosaic. It was a very intimate one, very mixed. Some of these images you see, these old maps, they're showing where there were trees. It's certainly not spanning the entire landscape, not covering all of the sandy terraces above the river. But this image from 1984 in the center shows the extent to which pine forests had become uh, dominant across that landscape by the 21st century. So that mosaic gets sort of taken apart over time by agricultural and industrial use. Already by the 1800s, you're seeing a lot of forests being felled for the Imperial Navy. Huge amounts of firewood were needed to make certain kinds of products. Potash as a fertilizer. Salt in eastern Ukraine was a very important product. Brackish water was that bubbles out of the ground was evaporated down into salt that deforested huge areas and have enough firewood for evaporators. And agriculture is spreading. And after the serfs are liberated emancipated from serfdom by Tsar Alexander II, lots of them are given very bad land in eastern Ukraine, the serfs that were there, that is on these sandy river terraces, classic procession from an alluvial lower floodplain and lower terrace to drier and drier terraces above that are sandy. And by the 1900s, shifting sands that have lost all their vegetative cover are a major problem on the terraces of the Siversky Donets River. It's becoming a major crisis for agriculture. And already in Tsarist times, a major effort is undertaken to reforest these sandy terraces, these landscapes, using initially planting, what's happening on the left is people are planting willow to just begin stabilizing the sand and drop some leaves that will create organic matter so that Scots pine can be planted after that. This is the beginning of what I sort of call the pinification of the entire landscape. But Tsarist era efforts were minor compared to what was done by Soviet authorities. This is a great moment to pause because this is a great forest scientist, Georgy Vysotsky. Ukraine's largest forest research institute is named after him in Kharkiv. And he spans the Tsarist and Soviet eras. He was not purged. He was allowed to continue doing forest science once the Bolsheviks take control of Ukraine and the rest of the Russian Empire. And all this time he is saying, look, these sandy landscapes in this part of this arid part, semi-arid part of the empire, um, we should not try to cover them all with trees. That is not their natural condition. Their natural condition is a mosaic of open sand. He actually believed even some open sand was important. I'll explain. Grasslands, savannas, agriculture, and some closed canopy forests. And he said if you try to cover this entire landscape with forests, especially pine, you will disrupt the hydrologic balance to the point that you will have water levels dropping that towns and cities and farmers need. And then you'll also have unhealthy, fire-prone forests. So don't do this, is what he said at pretty much the exact moment to say it, and he was not listened to. His sort of prophecy came true, and unfortunately, if a century ago Vysotsky had been listened to, we'd probably be in a much better place right now. He was not listened to, primarily by the Soviet authorities, who believed really that like you needed big sweeping campaigns to address big problems. There's problems with shifting sands in eastern Ukraine. There's not enough wood for the growing coal sector, for instance, which needs lots of timbers to hold up the coal mine shafts. There's not enough wood for building. People are miserable. The sand is blowing around. Then from horizon to horizon, we will cover the sandy areas with Scots pine. It was very politicized, ideological. These people on the left they're taking a break from planting trees to get basically a political lecture about socialism. Uh, it was what the Soviet Union did. Big things in enormous scale, sometimes with huge impact, often with horrible price, but everything had to be done big, and including this. This was done very big. And besides planting the shifting sands, which they're doing on the left, they also afforested what was left of the native grasslands. That's what you see on the right. They've That's not shifting sands. As you see, they actually plowed rows into an intact grassland to plant pine. These dry grasslands were not good for grazing. You could only keep a small amount of cattle on them before they get degraded. They had very low management value, and so Soviet authorities saw no reason whatsoever until something like a Soviet environmental movement would emerge much later. After the Second World War, ecologists started saying, oh, this might be important. And before that, it was just, this is not useful for people, then turn it into something useful. So what we got as a result of this campaign of reforestation and afforestation by Soviet authorities is a landscape absolutely dominated by the condition in the middle. Even-aged, artificially regenerated, um, uh, very dense, very, very dense Scots pine planted forests. Now, the other elements of the mosaic did not totally disappear. I show them around the edges here. What almost disappeared is what's in the lower right corner. That's sandy steppe, samophytic steppe, P-S-A-M-M-O-phytic, samophytic steppe. That's a nature reserve in eastern Ukraine. It's now been burned multiple times, but probably still sort of intact. The reason it was not planted to trees is that the Soviet Union trained tank drivers on this area. And so it was kept open. Um, it is that nearly disappeared. The wetlands and little pocket ponds in the lower left also, they didn't get turned into something, but the mass planting of pines uh, drained water horizons that were underneath the sand much faster than they could be replenished because all that pine's constantly respirating water. And so many of these ponds dried up and sort of changed into different kinds of much less wetlands, essentially, over time. So that element of the landscape is still there, but a lot of it's lost. Natural pine forests up on the upper left remained only largely in places where legislation prevented clear cutting and establishment of plantations. There was a real love, I would say, obsession with plantation silviculture across Soviet times that continued into independent Ukraine. This is the way you grow forests. Unfortunately, you can't do it in some places. Fine, there will be natural pine forests over there, but that's a very small part of the landscape now. And then essentially the hardwood the deciduous bottomland forests are still there. They were impossible to convert to pine. They're quite wonderful. They're still there. Um, so this is the landscape that we received from first forest afforestation and reforestation, then this much larger push in the Soviet Union. And as far as Eastern Ukrainians go, this is the beloved landscape for people who live near the Siversky Donets River. These pine forests were certainly loved by everyone. They did provide a lot of wood. They're certainly better than shifting sands. This was largely viewed as a success, although we understand that it really transformed a vegetative mosaic that was there before. But it begins to come undone, I would say, beginning in the 1990s. And a major driver is that it keeps getting hotter and drier, and precipitation keeps getting more and more contained to certain parts of the year in eastern Ukraine, leading to severe drought conditions that are very, very conducive to forest fires. So, we have this mosaic that's not what was there before, has much more pine at much higher densities than was there before. Although I do want to reiterate, Scots pine was a native part of this ecosystem. It's not introduced. It just was not growing in the ways that you see in that picture. Not in many places. You probably could have found that in some places, but it was really much more like many other xeric pine forests across Europe and North America, widely spaced, large trees with thick bark that can withstand ground fires. That uh, that we don't have very much of that. We have a lot of those dense planted forests, and they are not doing well from the 1990s onward, or I'd say the 80s onward, in this changing climate. So what the Soviet Union was able to create was sort of a snapshot in time that for maybe a generation or two generations was really a fairly successful forestry system that the climate starts undoing very quickly. So how do we start losing forest cover in eastern Ukraine in the Siversky Donets watershed? We have climate change, like I just said. In 1991, Ukraine gets independence and undergoes a long period of very difficult state forming. Soviet institutions collapse. New Ukrainian institutions form not instantly, with some difficulty. Finding enough funding for forest firefighting was very difficult for a long time. This decline in institutional capacity definitely does not help. You have a lot less people fighting fires in the forest. Uh, you have a rural culture that uses fire all the time to burn agricultural waste or to burn off grasslands so that they come back greener the next year, or to burn off straw in wheat fields. And with less institutional capacity and more people doing that, because there's less people telling them not to do it, you get a lot more fire. And before either of the wars in eastern Ukraine, our study, we looked at, comparative satellite images across time. Between 1989 and 2013, this region of, perhaps 400 to 500,000 hectares of forest in all loses 600, there are 60,900 acres just in that pre-war period from just greatly increased forest fire loss. Um, Now war. Then we get wars, right? In 2014, we get a very localized war, but one that's burns very hot, literally, in certain areas along the river. Unsurprisingly, the river and its forests are a very important strategic position in both of the wars. You can hide in the forests, you can put in military positions in the forest, whereas when you get off of these terraces, you have um, sunflower and wheat fields as far as the eye can see, with industrial cities embedded in them, mining towns, factory towns. Um, Forests are a very attractive place to hide. And the river becomes a very important front line. It's very easy to defend a position where the river is separating you from your enemy. So unfortunately, it brings the war into the forested terraces of the Siversky Donets River. The primary factor that starts destroying them in 2014 and much more in 2022 is that you have hundreds of thousands of flammable things being fired around, from simple bullets to bombs of quite intimidating size and caliber being fired nonstop. And you just have unbelievable amounts of ignition. Uh, in 2022 in particular, enough artillery is being fired in eastern Ukraine that you have large forest areas being destroyed without fire because they are being mowed down, which is something the world has not seen since the First World War. You can see some of that. These are all um, screenshots from Russian propaganda television about the liberation of eastern Ukraine, where they were embedded with the invading tank force. And you can see, especially on the right, I mean, essentially you have forest being cut off at mid-trunk by the amount of artillery fire. But even just let's look at the first period before the big war of 2022, the small war of 2014, both directly and indirectly by again really, really lowering state capacity. This is the Luhansk region. I lived for 6 years in Severodonetsk up there on the upper left in these images. Um, those are the sandy terrace pine forests to the north and east of that city. Um, this area already after 2014, 2015 has a lot of unexploded ordnance, a lot less firefighters, less policemen, less emergency service professionals, less people living in all the towns. It's a war zone. It's dangerous to live in some of these places. And so when a fire starts, it burns across this landscape with very few people to be able to respond. Once it starts burning, the government can't send in airplanes to try to put out the fires because first it has to coordinate with Russia so that Russia doesn't shoot down these planes from its positions just across the river, where the so-called Luhansk People's Republic, controlled by Russia, has military positions that can shoot down a Ukrainian airplane if they see it. So you lose days trying to get negotiations to use planes to put out the fire, and what you do is you lose an entire landscape of pine forests. This happened in 2020. Worst forest fire year in Ukraine's independence, I think. Sergei could probably confirm that. This is before the major invasion of 2022. The major invasion of 2022 is apocalyptically destructive to eastern Ukraine, to the communities there, to farmland and forests. Probably, we largely see an end to the pine forests of the Luhansk region, the easternmost province of Ukraine, with 2020 from 2022 to now. This image is from our paper. This is just what burned. The red is just what burned in the first 2 years of the large-scale invasion. Many of these are reburned areas, but essentially, as you can see, it's near destruction of this pine-dominated forest. So, how to get a little closer. So that was a lot of background. Now to get a little closer, how does this to the topic of our talk today, how does this disaster interact with the forest steppe mosaic that it's occurring within? And what we saw, I have a lot of images here, especially from 2020. Sergey and I did a lot of work together with a lot of his colleagues in the Luhansk region after the catastrophic fires of 2020. So this particularly will apply to that. And what we saw was a relatively small amount of the area burning with crown fires initially. So here's a classic image of extremely high intensity fire that burned all the foliage out of these trees in seconds. Sergey, I think this was like 8% of the burned area was crown fires. So of course we had a lot of hope, 8% of about 30,000 hectares in 2022. We had a lot of hope that maybe we'd see a lot of survival in areas that underwent low to high intensity ground fires. And I think what was perhaps most discouraging was that from about 2020 to 2022, before the big war, while we could still monitor this, we just saw basically almost everything that suffered from ground fires turn red and die. Just a very, very high level of follow-up die-off. This picture in particular shows a pretty high intensity ground fire. I mean, if any of you are forest fire experts, you'll see that. I mean, that's like 4 meters high flames up those trunks. But believe me, there were plenty of pine trees where the signs of fire were less than a meter up the trunk, and we still just saw them all redding out and mortality spreading across an extraordinarily large proportion of the area that was burned, um, which I think really just largely can be attributed to how low rigor and low health these forests were to begin with. Densely packed trees in high moisture stress competition with each other, with small crowns that have a hard time photosynthesizing enough to catch up with the damage. Quite a few secondary forest pests, of course, were able to move in, and so low vigor trees had a hard time responding to them. And I think we just really did not have a forest that was prepared for catastrophic disturbance like this. And so we saw that really awful continued die off. Now, uh, there is some positive experience in eastern Ukraine with forest fires or with forests going through a war-driven fire event and regenerating themselves pretty well. This is after 2014. In 2014, one of the places when the first war that suffered the most was Stanitsa Luhanska, the easternmost town of the easternmost province of Ukraine, right on the Russian border, right on the river. Um, It had very bad shelling in 2014. Forest firefighters had a very hard time extinguishing fires because of danger to their life, although they still tried and had multiple fire vehicles blow up and nearly lost some of their firefighters. Uh, and they were also only able to partially salvage after the fire dead pine. And they also had an extremely good approach. They left any pine tree that had any green needles on it whatsoever, understanding that many of them would put out a last crop of stress cones before death. Just very wise decisions by local foresters, and they got excellent regeneration across almost the entire area naturally, which I think was a bit of a shock to a forestry culture in eastern Ukraine that sort of believed in the sacred principle that you must plant. Everyone was sort of like, well, of course. I mean, in Stanitsa, it's true. I mean, the pine replanted itself. But other than that, you really need to plant. And it was rather like, well, maybe this is an interesting lesson, because there are, of course, other examples of excellent natural regeneration of pine in the region. It's just that the ethos of plantation silviculture was so deep in in the region. This really surprised a lot of people, what you see in this image, which is not wall-to-wall regeneration, although there are places where it was very uniform. But certainly speaks to the ability of this forest type to maintain itself without artificial regeneration and potentially form a more sustainable mosaic that has more breaks in it, that doesn't always have high density, allows for some trees to grow in isolation from each other and grow larger and have thicker bark, etc. But this experience is difficult to recreate because of how apocalyptic 2022 was. For instance, everything we see here burned again in 2022. All of this natural regeneration is now gone. And we saw in 2020 a quite remarkable pulse of pine, birch, aspen regeneration after the fires. So there was a moment when there was sort of a very urgent moment. Can we think about a different approach to regenerating these pine forests and to a different kind of vegetative mosaic? Um, because nature's throwing us a ball here. There was a quite amazing regeneration pulse in that first, right after the fires in 2021, we started seeing this. Now, a hot summer and um, approximately half of these seedlings died, but the other half did not. So, I mean, it was still a high stress environment, but this was uh, I would say, actually quite remarkable opportunity in eastern Ukraine that simply was unable to be capitalized on because the enormous war came right on its heels. But also, also because of some difficulties of Ukrainian legislation and simply the ethos of Ukrainian forestry, especially in the East. Um, uh, First and foremost, it was how to explain it? I'll try not to go too far down this rabbit hole, but essentially there was a lot of dead wood that needed to be salvaged very quickly. But certain regulations, including around the necessity to do an environmental impact assessment, um, forced the authorities to wait quite a while before they started cutting, and then they were very desperate to get as much wood as they can, and they did a lot of salvage clear cutting, which unfortunately just so thoroughly solarized these sites that even if they didn't run over all of the pine seedlings, they were pretty much roasted off of these areas. And then, of course, they'd say, "Oh, well, that is frustrating. I guess we'll have to plant," which gets us back in the cycle of too dense forests with too much uniformity. Um, Really excellent work was done to try to salvage some of this dead pine timber carefully and in what was essentially a selective salvage cut. I think you can see the color though of all those crowns. Forestry authorities in eastern Ukraine were just chasing the mortality. They were rushing to try to get some timber out of the burned area. They were trying to leave seed trees. They were trying to do things right, even if the law was pushing them hard towards salvage clear cuts. And it just was extremely bad conditions for pine survival. So this big pulse of pine regeneration was also hard. Pine and birch and aspen, it was important that they were in a mixture, was difficult for foresters to be able to take advantage also because of the rules and the traditions that they work within. But pine is the only thing that grows on this landscape. How did the rest of the vegetation respond? Many of you who are deal with fire ecology will be unsurprised to learn that deciduous species often did much better. And this is this picture image is real, although it kind of looks like I've sort of doctored it to make the pine forest look like it's black and white. Um, this is, English oak, pedunculate oak, woodland, widely spaced, naturally regenerated trees, low timber value. They were largely just left alone, happily, by the foresters, next to a pine plantation that was incinerated. The same fire went through the oak woodland, certainly damaged it, but essentially those those deciduous patches embedded on these sandy terraces pretty much showed their ecological resilience through all of these fire disasters. And in fact, they are still there, even as pine is largely disappearing from this landscape. The deciduous patches have resilience. They have ecological adaptations to this. Um, Even when, there was fairly catastrophic mortality. I mean, this is a birch aspen patch on the left. Of course, 99% of those trees died when a crown fire blasting through the surrounding pine forest also went through them. But these are pioneer hardwood species. We know what they do. They reseed. The aspen resprouts from its roots. The birch massively seeds in. Um, they essentially instantaneously regenerated themselves. On the right is a crown fire blasted through this oak woodland. I saw it with Sergei early spring, and we thought, oh, this is awful. Even the hardwood is dead. And within 4 months, we called them porcupine trees or hedgehog trees because they massively epicomically sprouted, looked very sort of spiky and spiny, and revegetated. They were fine, essentially. I mean, obviously, the tree suffers, but deciduous forest loss was marginal, while pine forest loss, I think, must be approaching 90% at this point. Similarly, black alder wetland forests, really wonderful, lush sort of oases in this very dry landscape. It was very sad to see fires blast through them as well. Massive alder regeneration there, as you can see. These deciduous ecosystems are much more resilient. And on the right, we have a pine plantation that was adjacent to some deciduous patches. That probably now is potentially a low productivity birch aspen stand because those species were able to massively seed in. Unfortunately, outside of the low wet depressions, there's probably not enough moisture to productively grow those species. Um, and those little pocket wetlands and ponds that I was talking about, which, are a major part of the landscape across, let's say, the Luhansk region, the sandy terraces of the Siversky Donets. I think if you were to stop and count all of the ones on a map, there'd probably be several thousand of these pocket ponds. They're just very, very small. Um, and they had been drying out, as I said, because you had a drying climate, less precipitation, and all this pine planted right up to the edge of them that was wicking up and respirating water. And they all sort of became these sort of grassy, peaty, slightly wet ecosystems, but no standing water. And obviously, a lot of species that, I mean, when there's standing water, there's waterfowl, for instance, there's frogs and turtles, there's beavers using these patches. When there's no standing water, a lot of that is not there. Um, Unsurprisingly, they rehydrated. Um, Basically, all the water in that image on the left was not there when everything around it was green pine. I mean, you see some vestigial pine in that image. There's a little bit still. Uh, in 2019, that would have been wall-to-wall green, and those would not, there would have been no standing water. Um, this has been seen multiple times in the past in forest fires in eastern Ukraine that ponds return, wetlands return after forest fires, and then redisappear after reforestation. Uh, so to some extent, this destruction of the pine element of this vegetative mosaic is probably regenerating and revitalizing the wetland element of it. And, I'll get to this in my last slides, but I mean, what we should not do is try to then turn the dial back all the way so that they would dry up again. Clearly, we need a forest mosaic that's better adapted to this hydrological uh, regime. So I'd like to finish with a few slides about, where do you go from here? Where do we go from here? This is, the floodplain of the Siversky Donets. Near the city of Lysychansk. Wonderful time. This particular landscape right now, those chalk steps on the right, um, have had so much artillery fired into them, you would see a big white crater about every 5 meters. And the floodplain forests have suffered, although again, that much, much, much higher resilience of deciduous communities to that kind of damage. They're still there. To the right, or to the left of us would have been a vast landscape of pine plantation and a little bit of native pine forest, and it's essentially gone. But this was the landscape that we had. Extraordinarily beautiful. This is really Sergei and his team's specialization. I'll just speak to it very briefly. That again, with institutional capacity, we had a situation when it was very hard to fight the fires that climate change was creating more and more of. And that was also a problem of having authorities that are meant to put out fires in towns and authorities that are meant to put out fires in forests. But almost all the fires were starting in agricultural land and spreading into towns and into forests and picking up, intensity in a part of the landscape that was sort of no one's responsibility. Agricultural land, and especially abandoned agricultural land or these little garden plots outside of villages or low use pastures that people would throw a match into to burn off, or they'd burn their garden waste, and the fires, storming then into the surrounding forest. And what's really will be needed in eastern Ukraine is a landscape mandate for firefighting. There needs to be an agency that fights fires everywhere and can go at them as soon as they start, doesn't matter where they are. And that agency needs to be equipped with incredibly, with the best technology for protecting for firefighters from unexploded ordnance that exists. And that technology is largely German. The Germans have a lot of UXO contaminated landscapes in former East Germany that were training grounds for the Warsaw Pact, and they've developed basically firefighting tanks. And Ukraine could definitely use a fleet of these in the east. Um, And what you really need to do is just rush out as soon as you get the slightest indication of a fire and try to extinguish it at the very earliest stage, or it's essentially going to be hopeless because you're going to get into more and more dangerous territory the farther it spreads. And it's really, really, really time in Ukraine to confront the rural culture of using fire. Um, there can be quite wonderful rural traditions using fire that help maintain certain ecosystems in Ukraine, and this is an even bigger issue in Russia. It's just out of control the amount of fire that's used in village life. It's not healthy for any kind of ecosystem. It's very bad for organic matter in the soil. It's just sort of the go-to vegetation management tool. It's very bad. I'm sure there are millions of years of life lost in rural Eastern Europe from just people breathing fires like this all their life, breathing smoke from these fires. I mean, just imagine now that we know what wood stoves do to people's respiratory systems. Imagine the landscape burns every year, maybe two different seasons for your entire life. The effect on human health. It's yeah, and this needs to be addressed with incentives. People need to be given better opportunities to do composting. And frankly, the authorities just need to go out and arrest people who are burning um, agricultural waste. Unfortunately, there's no way without some coercion to make this practice stop. But more importantly, vegetation. Um, the fires have broken up. When I wrote this slide for an earlier presentation several years ago, I'd say they've kind of done more than break up. They've largely eliminated one of the elements of this landscape mosaic, although it can come back, being pine. They've broken up though what was a very uniform, almost homogeneous uh, landscape mosaic, and we should not try to push it back to homogeneity. It would be a disaster. I would say in a few places of liberated Eastern Ukraine, the sort of mechanism is clicked back into place, and even in places where there's a scary amount of unexploded ordnance, forestry authorities are trying to replant pine plantations. It's a very understandable instinct. I think it needs some really serious thinking. I would really, really not just go back into trying to establish plantations everywhere. Especially on these sandy terraces, we should be looking at a mosaic, an intimate mosaic that doesn't have very, very large blocks of any one kind of these conditions. They need to be mixed and matched across the landscape of forest, savanna, and steppe. This will reduce the landscape susceptibility to the spread of ground fires. It'll make it more resilient to ground fires and to drought and to other stressors. If we do not have wall-to-wall, horizon-to-horizon pine plantation. And a very important part of this is we have to stop trying to destroy grasslands to establish plantations. This is a sandy steppe along the Siversky Donets River near the village of Tryohizbenka that is very, very dry. On all the old historic maps, it never has forests on it. Since the Second World War, Soviet and Ukrainian foresters have been trying to afforest this steppe about every 10 years. They have plowed it up, I don't know how many times, and drought and fire kills everything they plant over and over again. And in 2020, when it burned again, the plan was to replant it. Just stop trying to turn arid grasslands into forests that will never repay in any way. It's the cost of establishing the forest. These are biodiverse ecosystems, the grasslands, that have very low respiration, and so they help build up the underground water horizon that's needed for many other things. And they don't need to be money to be spent on them and to be taken care of. This area can just be a sandy steppe. It will cost the Ukrainian government less. Now, it will take a long time for this ecosystem to recover because, as you can see, it's washboarded into all of these areas. As they tried to reestablish plantations so many times, they plowed it up. I don't know how many times. It's a very traumatized ecosystem, but just left alone, it will become a grassland again. This is not the only place. This is under Russian occupation right now, so it's an academic question, but there are many places like this. Stop the war on grasslands. That's one of the lessons I think we need to take. Diversify pine management, diversify it away from almost exclusive reliance on artificial regeneration. This is natural regeneration near a health resort where clear cutting was prohibited. The foresters would just sort of pick away at the woods every year, picking out a little bit of pine when it was started dying or anything. It was like a informal selection harvest. And there was beautiful pine regeneration in all kinds of cohorts all across the landscape. Frankly, shelter woods selection and harvesting would work fine in many of these ecosystems, would be a way to maintain pine cover in a way that's less vulnerable to these catastrophic fires. It just was not the practice. Um, and, plantation silviculture should be focused on very high productivity soils that are not contaminated with unexploded ordnance, that are near markets, mills, and that fire foresters believe they can protect from fires. And that's going to be a piece of the landscape, not the entire landscape. And embrace mixed stands. You can also see oak and birch in this stand. Embrace lower densities, natural lower densities, and more uneven forest structure. All of this will help with forest health. Um, and build hydrology into your decision making about forest management. For me, that especially means where you have areas with a very high density of these pocket wetlands and ponds, do not plant the entire landscape around them to high density pine plantations. We have now multiple cycles of seeing that violates the hydrologic regime and causes these ecosystems to go into decline. I think areas with a high density of these should have a certain buffer zone around them. We'd need better science to understand how large it needs to be. And maybe low density pine savannas could be established in that area. But we don't want to lose these ecosystems. It's difficult to exaggerate how much they contribute to biodiversity in a dry, xeric, sandy landscape. I mean, look at this. It's lush, right? This is important. We should not be making decisions that harm this kind of ecosystem, which is also, as I mentioned, much more resilient as long as you don't drain it to forest fires. It's largely birch and alder, which, as I showed earlier, regenerate themselves fantastically. So, I think I'm bumping up to my time. Thank you very much. Happy to answer questions. Thank you for this little tour through this kind of lost landscape of the forests of the Siversky Donets. This is the Kremena forest, extraordinarily beautiful forest in the Luhansk region. Presently, Ukrainian forces are trying to push into the city of Kremena through this forest to liberate it from Russian occupation, and everything you see in this picture has been obliterated over tens of thousands of hectares of this kind of forest. There will be a time when we can try to bring something back here, and it's a great responsibility to think about the forest that will be resilient to this climate, that will also meet the needs and wants of Eastern Ukrainians. It's an enormous and fascinating challenge. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian. Thank you for this great insight. I can say that we spent a lot of time with Brian in this forest working on a fire management plan for Lugansk Oblast. And we communicated with all stakeholders, starting with Oblast civil military administration and ending with local communities, foresters, emergency service, military, whatever. And actually, I would like to start answer question and answer session. And as you remember, when we talked with the people, with the communities, we say that you should not have like such a wide, such a big pine forest because it's threat for your villages. And they were not happy because they grew up with this pine forest and they pick up mushrooms and they enjoy just summertime, etc., etc. So my question, if we are talking about the war is still going on, but earlier or later it will be ended, and we should think about rehabilitation. if we are thinking about rehabilitation, this is a like kind of usually national program. Now a lot of donors already accumulated funding for funding this rehabilitation. Then it's usually the agency take a responsibility for the rehabilitation. In our case, it maybe will be forestry agency. And then where is the place of local community in this rehabilitation program? Because foresters may replicate the old story. So just plant pine all over the steppe, all over the sand, all over the territory. And then, so how the communities maybe look for the future of their, because we are working for them, even agency and everybody, they are main stakeholders, they are living there. How would community see what is their vision for future of this region and how their voice can be funded within this scheme of international donor funding and agency, Ukrainian government involvement. This is, I think, is a
Yeah.
critical point. Thank you. And then, yes.
Um, Thank you, Sergey. That's a very heavy and important question. And I think it's important to acknowledge that this sort of vision of a more diverse forest mosaic, um, a lot of Ukrainian forest ecologists and scientists subscribe to this idea. Um, it would be a major dialogue with the people who live there, although now it's rather lived, and I'll get to that in a moment. I mean, these communities are largely depopulated now, but uh, it would be a major dialogue with them, and I think that the ecological community would really need to invest in messaging and making their case, because I can tell you that instinctively, the majority of people, and you certainly encountered this, um, really sort of believed in the campaign of tree planting. After the 2020 fires, an enormous number of people were just always asking the forestry authorities, when can we get out and help you plant trees? Um, People loved those dense pine forests, and we need to acknowledge that. I think it's physically impossible to bring them back all across the land. And no matter what we do, we will get a more diverse mosaic because there are large forest areas that are so contaminated with unexploded ordnance, it would be criminal to send foresters out to establish plantations. And I don't believe that the authorities will try. Um, but the people would largely, probably initially, really just want to see it all replanted. And I think their perspectives, of course, must be respected. I think what would really be needed is sort of a zoning exercise, trying to find the places that have the most emotional and practical value to local communities and really focus maybe some of the active reforestation on those areas. Um, and I think there are more remote parts of this landscape that might be managed closer to this regime that I've been talking about that would have a much lower level of pushback from locals because very few people reach them. But again, also many of these communities are a shadow of their former population. Many are destroyed. Um, of course, many of them are presently the entirety of Luhansk Oblast is under occupation, and we don't know how many people remain in a lot of those villages. It will be a population of that we don't know how many people will return, how traumatized people will be, whether there can be any focus at all on it. It will be, I think, a uniquely complex restoration process and talking to these communities. But in places that are already back under government control, like Izium in the Kharkiv region, unfortunately, several people have died picking mushrooms. You cannot keep and going down to the Siversky Donets River to fish. You cannot keep Eastern Ukrainians out of these forests if they're there. It's virtually impossible. So no matter what, there will have to be that dialogue with them. And I think, it'll be, again, finding those places in the landscape that maybe the element of plantations is not just good for growing timber, but good for what communities want to see back while looking at, like savannas, for instance, quite literally just farther, and also in the UXO contaminated places where the nature is going to regenerate those areas no matter what we do.
Thank you. So please, any questions to Brian? We still have time for questions. You can type in a chat or just go ahead with your microphone. Okay. I don't see. Yes, let me summarize that now we see that actually rehabilitation, even if we have funding, if we have proper people on site, communities, then the concept, strategy, and implementation, it's pretty complicated process. So we could not, like in our task force, the slogan of our task force, let's make it better. And so our task is much more complicated, restricted with the contamination on unexploded ordnance and the climate change. And so, yes, it's a lot of work ahead. Okay, with this, I would like to thank. Okay, Alexander, I have a question. Please
Yeah.
go ahead. Alexander,
Brian, thank you very much for such interesting presentation. I find it's very relevant to our needs now in our forestry activity, forestry direction, even this war not ended yet. So I have the question very relevant with and similar with Nikolai Denisov, which has just sent it to the chat. For your opinion, should we clean the forestry area from the UXO, or should we leave this territory? And if yes, if we should clean, how deep we should do this? Because it is pretty difficult, of course, to clean forestry area from the unexploded ordnance. And what we should do with this forest on your point of view?
Yeah, extremely important and difficult question as well. I mean, I think a triage is necessary. I think putting in the effort to actually decontaminate, high productivity forests near communities is going to have to happen. And, you know, several of us on the call today have worked with a small NGO called Forest Release in Ukraine that was really focused on this question, including using new technologies like drone technology to try to detect UXO in forests, which is a much more difficult condition to to detect UXO in than, for instance, farmland. I think that effort needs to be made on as much of the landscape as we can, but my personal belief is that will be far from the majority of the contaminated area. I don't think it will be possible to even get to like 50% of the contaminated area in any near term when we see Ukraine's backlog of agricultural and urban areas, or I would say urban, it could be a village, but I mean like settled areas and agricultural land, they will get priority above forests. And that is already a massive multi-decade process. Um, so I think, and it's also very difficult because it's very hard to say if a forest has any UXO. Well, it's very hard to say if it has none. It's easy to say if it has any. You just have to find one, and that means that forest is contaminated. Confirming that there's none, as any scientist knows, is a very difficult thing to do, right? And so foresters and loggers are going to have an extraordinarily dangerous job no matter what in the coming years, and tree planters. So I think a lot of effort needs to be put onto those most productive forest sites, looking at, the highest site index, proximity to roads and the ability to fight fire there, proximity to towns so that people see a lot of significance. And then I think, as has been the case in many war damaged landscapes, we're going to have certain areas become de facto protected wildlands because it's physically impossible to decontaminate them. We've seen that in the Balkans. Some places in Central Asia, you just will never be able to get all the UXO out, and they become wildlands. I think there's some agricultural land in eastern Ukraine that should be let go back to steppe because even in a plowed field, it will be difficult to find it all. So maybe not a super satisfying answer. I think, yes, we need to try, but we should never imagine we can reach even most of the contaminated acres.
Yes.
Thank you, Brian.
Rather pessimistic take.
Yeah, thank you. At least until the new technology will be developed,
Yeah.
probably.
Well, Ukraine is already making leaps and bounds in UXO decontamination technology, including Ukrainian farmers who rigged up remote controlled tractors to, I mean, it's remarkable. And I believe Ukraine will contribute a lot to UXO science.
Yes, another Alexander, please have a question.
Hi, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, thank you for a very informative presentation. And just to complement this very different vulnerability of deciduous and coniferous forest fires is also very clearly seen on remote sensing images. Just maybe a small remark. We probably would better tell here not about the different resilience, but of different ecological strategy of different trees. Because, for example, pine trees can be easily damaged by fire, but they could also much easily be regenerated than, for example, oaks. Just like a hypothesis. And I also have a small question about your remark regarding taking a very aggressive stance towards eliminating any potential forest fires in the areas, because if we are agreed on reversing to this savanna type ecosystem in this case, so fires can also, at least fire can be seen as a part of natural dynamics also of these ecosystems. And if we eliminate any small fire, we can end up with accumulating a very huge like fuel load, and then we could end up with very large fires, which would be practically impossible to exterminate. So how do you see whether we should be more resilient here regarding this fire extermination approach? Thank you.
Thank you. Excellent comment and question. And yes, I'd have to agree with you. Thank you for that nuance. I mean, some of what actually was being done after the 2020 fires in the East, led by Dr. Zipsev, by Sergei, was involved bringing prescribed fire into that landscape, which was just mind-boggling to foresters to use fire because of their extremely hostile attitude to fire in general. And so thank you for catching me. Yeah, I think we do need fire in these landscapes. We need to have the capacity to put it out very quickly, because there will still be parts of the landscape that quite simply cannot adapt, cannot have no resilience to a high intensity fire. As we get more of the landscape into a condition with higher resilience to especially low intensity fires, we absolutely should want to see them there. The grasslands of eastern Ukraine probably need a certain amount of fire. What you would see in small fragmentary grasslands, especially higher moisture ones in the east, that they were very often gradually growing into the first pioneer species would be wild pear, and then other hardwoods would come behind it. And sometimes it was only grazing or hay mowing that would keep them in anything resembling a grassland ecosystem. Really, what they probably need was either lots and lots of grazing of wild animals, which will not be in any time soon, or fire. So yes, absolutely. And I think that you need the capacity to be able to put out fires very aggressively, which also gives you more comfort to maybe let low intensity fires do their work in the landscape. And yes, regarding absolutely, pine has adaptations to these kind of catastrophic disturbances. I think left alone for a long time, what we'd see is pine returning to its more natural adaptation here, which is using certain parts of the landscape, using out in the sandy areas, using relatively sort of mid levels of moisture would really be its niche. It will regenerate there and be able to withstand fires, the very driest places, which are often the sort of domed higher zones, would be grassland or open sand. With enough time, I think we'll start seeing the species expressing their particular adaptations to this climate much better without, especially if we can keep the foresters from trying to sort of force one of those species back into every niche.
Yes, thank you, Brian. Any questions? I think it's it's time to thank you for this nice discussion, and yes, let's see what happens. In fact, we need a strategy. Of course, we need a strategy which will be approved by national or regional government, and then which include all those components. But first of all, we need the research and then training to increase capacity of managers, of land managers, and they must work together on to reach some objectives that Brian actually mentioned. Thank Brian for this nice century overview of the history of the region, and let's hope we will be back there and we'll work on that. Thank you, everybody, to participate in our first webinar of our task force, and please join our next webinars. You will be informed through IUFRO network and other sources. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.